We now have the first witness for TSMJC, Mr. Annabelle. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, I have put up several volumes on the table there. Perhaps we could mark those. Starting with the TSMJC Properties Inc. Phase 1 Book of Documents. Could be exhibit, I think we're at 51.
51 is correct. So that's Phase 1 Book of Documents.
Yes, sir. Then the Phase 1 Book of Witness Statements would be exhibit 52.
Right. And the witness
Phase
statement
1
compendium,
which contains the redacted witness statements, would be exhibit 53. Sir, for the examination in chief, at least, you will need exhibit 52, which we've just marked, exhibit 51, which we've just marked, exhibit 10, exhibit 13.
Exhibit 10.
Yes, sir.
And
13. And 35. And 34.
right.
And then 4 of the joint document book volumes. Exhibit 1A, 1C, 1G, and 1H.
Okay.
With the tribunal's permission, sir, I'm going to lead Mr. Swinton through his qualifications and then ask that he be qualified as an expert to give evidence in the area of land use planning. Mr. Swinton, oh, sorry, he should be sworn first.
Yes. Prefer to be sworn or to affirm, sir?
Affirm, please.
Affirm. Could you just raise your right hand, and could you affirm that the evidence you will give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Swinton's CV can be found attached to his witness statement at tab 1 of Exhibit 52, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. Mr. Swinton, you are currently semi-retired and working through your own consulting firm, is that correct? Innovative Development Solutions, Inc.?
Yes.
And from 2005 to 2018, you were the manager of urban design at PMG Planning Consultants, correct?
Yes.
And prior to that, you started your own consulting firm and were president of Silverleaf Developments, Inc. as well?
Yes.
And from 88 to 2003, you were the urban designer and senior urban designer with the former city of Scarborough.
And then City of Toronto with amalgamation.
Thank
Yes.
you. You have your Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Toronto, graduating in 1986, is that correct?
Yes.
And you're a full member of the Canadian Institute of Planners and OPPI from 98 through to 2017.
Yes.
And I take it you're not a full member now because you're semi-retired?
Yes.
All right. And you have provided professional urban design and planning evidence before the Ontario Municipal Board, now the LPAT, on behalf of Scarborough and Toronto as part of your private sector work?
Yes. Public sector work since 1994. I was qualified and as an expert in urban design, and in my private sector work also as an expert in land use planning.
And you do work throughout the Greater Toronto area, is that correct?
I do.
And you've dealt with all manners of planning instruments, including zoning, draft plan of subdivision, official plan amendments, secondary plans, et cetera?
Yes.
All right, sir, I would, subject to any questions that you or others may have, I would ask that Mr. Swinton be qualified as an expert to give evidence in the area of land use planning.
Any questions with respect to the qualifications? Mr. Swinton out there? Okay.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Swinton, perhaps you could tell the tribunal how you came to be retained and give some background around your involvement, please.
PMG was first retained by TSMJC in August of 2007 to advise on the Richmond Hill official plan, on the KDA secondary plan and zoning process, and to assist in the planning applications on its lands at 10909 Yonge Street, which is the vast majority of the southeast quadrant of the KDA, and to advise on other applications in the KDA. So Richmond Hill endorsed the Part 1 official plan in July 2010, followed by York Region's approval in May 2011. PMG filed a letter with the town raising concerns on June 8th, 2010, and with the region on May 3rd, 2011. TSMJC was one of 47 appellants. Since that time, only 5 appellants remain, and I would draw your attention to Exhibit 52, the joint book, Exhibit 1.
Volume 3, C, 1C, Volume 3.
Tab 8. Unfortunately, I do not have the volumes. I have it on computer. And maybe if Mr. Ruddick, who is my technical assistant, could call it up on the screen, that would be most helpful.
I'll just share my screen now.
Page 562 of tab 8. And if you can scroll down and zoom in on, I think the first thing I'd like to note on page 562 is the nature of the appeal. So we could zoom in one more time. When we refer to policies in the Part 1 plan, you will see an S or an SS beside the appeal. So the S is a site or area specific, which in my understanding is a KDA wide appeal. And an SS, which is truly site specific, is for the TSMJC lands only. So if we go to the next page, please. And you can see number 10 is TSMJC properties. So any policy that we go to in the Part 1 plan that has highlighted with a 10 and an S or an SS, that those are policies that are subject to TSMJC's appeals. So TSMJC has resolved many of the issues through the process and has withdrawn various objections in settlement orders getting to this point. So we are dealing with 7 issues at this hearing. There are 7 policies at this hearing. There are a total of 16 policies remaining under TSMJC's appeal. And it is my understanding through the process that the balance of those 9 appeals will be dealt with in the Phase 2 hearing. They're not relevant to the issues list for the Phase 1 hearing.
We'll get to those a little later.
Yeah. So the 7 include the 2 policies within Section 441, which the city is now proposing to amend through TSMJC's outstanding appeal. And as I said, the balance, and then there are also policies that we have identified that are relevant to the Phase 1 issues that for a large part we are agreeing upon or have very minor wording, and putting these policies in place in the Phase 1 hearing will essentially allow for the densities and other proposals that's also being sought by the city for the secondary plan.
Right, and does our mutual client, TSMJC, did they file any development applications for their lands?
Yes, on August 19th, 2016, TSMJC filed an OPA and rezoning application to develop the southeast corner of the lands with a 338 unit residential development consisting of a 16-story slab building and back-to-back townhouses fronting Yorkland Street. After additional documentation was requested, the application was deemed complete as of November 17th, 2016. That is in TSMJC's Book 2, Exhibit 53, can be found at tab 13. I'm not sure if we need to go there. It's just there for reference if you need.
It's up on the screen in any event.
Okay, perfect. So there's the confirmation of the application being deemed complete. On May 18th, 2017, TSMJC appealed the town's failure to make a decision on these applications, and in March 2018, council directed staff to oppose these appeals. Moving on November 28th, 2016, Richmond Hill Council adopted interim control bylaw 100-16 for the Bernard KDA. And on that date, I made a deputation to council on behalf of TSMJC expressing my opinion that the secondary plan process and the evolution of the TSMJC applications could proceed in conjunction with each other without the need for interim control. On January 24th, 2017, TSMJC appealed the passing of the interim control bylaw. The town, with the assistance of Urban Strategies, prepared the KDA secondary plan through 2017. I attended a meeting with town and the consultants on January 11th, October 23rd, and a workshop hosted by the consultants on March 1st and the open house on March 30th, all 2017 dates. I reviewed the consultant's May 3rd interim report and the draft secondary plan and zoning bylaws first issued in early October, and the staff reports of July 4th and November 20th, all 2017. I attended and made deputation at council on November 1st and assisted in the preparation of objection letters submitted by Davies Howe LLP on July 4th and November 27th, 2017. On November 27th, council adopted the KDA secondary plan and zoning, and TSMJC appealed these on December 5th, 2017. In an attempt to resolve the issues with the application, the Part 1 plan, and the KDA secondary plan and zoning appeals, I met with the town on November 28th, 2018, February 20th, 2019, and June 5th, 2019. And had numerous additional communications as well. Without prejudice, changes to the development application intended to meet staff concerns were circulated on May 28th, 2019, July 5th, 2019, and April 1st, 2020. And I attended an open house for the proposed secondary plans change hosted by the consultants and the city on December 10th, 2019. And even though I'm semi-retired, I semi-retired in 2018, I agreed to follow through with this process, providing professional services to TSMJC.
And Mr. Swinton, have you been listening to the planning evidence of the other witnesses in the hearing?
Yes, I have.
All right. So perhaps you could address the issues that are still outstanding with respect to the TSMJC appeal using Exhibit 13, which Mr. Reddick's going to put up for us right now. Please run through those.
Okay. The issues have been set out and are based on themes in the phase 1 hearing. And so my response will be grouping them in themes. So the issues set out in the witness witness statement only relate to policies and provisions that are relevant to the Part 1 plan, in particular the following. Part 1 OP policies 3.1.3 sub 5, 3.1.3 sub 8, 3.1.4 sub 3, 4.4.1 sub 6, 4.4.1 sub 7, 4.4.1 sub 9, and 5.72. And the secondary plan policies 12.2.35 sub 5, 12.4.2 sub 3, and proposed policy introduced in May 20, 12.5.4.2, and 12.5.5 sub 1. The following policies and provisions in my witness statement were originally proposed for phase 1 but have been moved to phase 2 in settlement between the city and TSMJC. Secondary plan policies 12.1.1, 12.2, the first section only, 12.2.2, 12.2.3, Schedule 1, the character areas section, Schedule 2, density, Schedule 3, open space as it relates to roads only, and Schedule 4, streets as it relates to the roads only. The zoning bylaw provisions 1.2, Schedule B and C only, Table A 3.1, the minimum floor space index only, Table A 3.2, special provision 8, Table A 3.2, special provision 9, and special provision 14 of the same table, and new provision 5.34 introduced in May 20th, and schedules A, B, and C of the zoning bylaw. Again, all moved to phase 2. It's my understanding that all of the other KDA-wide policies and provisions remain under appeal, including policies and provisions which are not specifically listed, along with any TSMJC site-specific or quadrant-specific issues shall be considered through the phase 2 hearing. My understanding of the settlement.
All right, and the next theme?
The first theme is the bus terminal. TSMJC and the city and the region of York have settled on revised revisions to the secondary plan policies 12.4.23 and 12.5.5, and those are found in Exhibit 10. So just to go back into a little bit of history, I think we've seen these, and I'm not going to read them for you. I trust you're familiar with them, but I want to make reference back to the policy from first approved in Richmond Hill Council in 2017, and secondary plan policy, and that's found on tab 26 of Exhibit 1, and I'm not too sure what book that is.
That's 1G, volume 7.
And if we go to consecutive page 2272, and 12.4.23 stated that development shall support the potential redevelopment of the Bernard bus terminal as an integrated use within the Bernard KDA, including potential configuration of bus facilities integrated into the development of the future street network and or integrated into a mixed-use building. The May 2020 version, and that's found at tab 32 of the same exhibit.
Sorry, it's at Exhibit 1H, volume 8.
Okay, so this I'm referring to this because this version shows where changes have been made between 2017 and 2020. So I'm highlighting that the policy in 2020 or 2017 basically referred to development in general, and the words within the southeast quadrant were added in May 2020. And I'd also point out that it said development within the Bernard KDA. So the settlement focused, and if we can go back then to the settlement exhibit 10, focused back to development within the KDA in the first sentence. And in the second line, you can see as an integrated use serving the Bernard KDA. So not simply within, but changed to serving. So those are the first portions of the changes to the
And that's
that
actually, Mr. Swinton, that's actually in Exhibit 35. Exhibit 10 is the agreement between the parties. It does
Okay.
have the language attached to it as well.
Okay. Okay. Then an additional sentence was added to the 2017 policy that stated the ultimate location of the Bernard of the bus terminal shall be determined in consultation with the transit authority, ensuring maximum utility and efficiency of service over the long term. That was in the 2020 version. The settlement language, if we go to the settlement, expands the consultation related to the ultimate size and location. So if we take a look at that, in consultation with the transit authority and all other stakeholders. And then settlement language also refers to an environmental assessment process if one is required. And in my opinion, given the current land ownership and driveway configuration, expansion beyond one additional bay would trigger the need for a significant redesign, requiring a significant new lands, and therefore would trigger the EA process. So I'll go into discussing that specifically. I recognize from the testimony this morning of Mr. Kawun that the region is not sure how many bays. He had indicated the potential of 11, but I'm speaking now just to whatever the physical design constraints of the station as it is, and the ability to expand within the current design and current land ownership configuration. The settlement language also ties to a land acquisition process, ties it to the Planning Act, and settlement language ensures fair market compensation for the land. The settlement language allows the region to use funding mechanisms such as cost sharing among benefiting owners within the KDA. With the settlement, it is my opinion that the revised language unfairly limits the potential location of redevelopment of the bus terminal to only the TSMJC lands.
And what is your opinion with respect to the settlement in Exhibits 10 and 35?
I agree with the witness statement of Mr. Carr that a new design need not necessarily occur on the TSMJC lands. And if Mr. Ruddick, if you could take us to Book 1, Exhibit 52, Tab 5, page 91. And in paragraph 4.2.4, I'm also of the opinion of the potential location of the terminal should not be limited to the southeast quadrant of the intersection of Yonge Street and Bernard, and that all 4 quadrants surrounding the intersection are appropriate for further investigation. Other sites to consider should remain within the Bernard KDA, maintain the integration with the Viva station on Yonge Street and Bernard, the 2 platforms, and you can see in the diagram below the platform on the south side on Yonge, the one on the left is shown, and then you just see a portion of the platform on the north side on the right-hand side. The existing location accomplishes this, but in his opinion, so do the other 3 quadrants of the Yonge Bernard intersection. And I'll say Yonge, Bernard, Canyon Hill, because Canyon Hill is on the other side. With the Viva stops currently being constructed on both the north and south side, the location on any of the four corners of that intersection would provide equal proximity for transfers between Viva and YRT. And if we go to the next page, page 92 of Mr. Carr's statement, and look at paragraph 4.3.2, I agree with his statement that all lands within the KDA benefit from the redevelopment of the Bernard Transit Terminal and its associated increased transit capacity, not just the TSMJC lands. And I'm not too sure if I need to read that. We can see that in his paragraph 4.3.2. It's my opinion that the current configuration of the bus terminal with the bus drive aisles and bus bays separating the building edge from the public sidewalk does not animate and define the main intersection of the KDA in the way that's intended by the Part 1 official plan. And I'll first take you to Book 1, Exhibit 52, Tab 7. If we can look at page 132 first. Okay. So 132, we have an aerial version, a view of the terminal, and we can see that the building is set back. There, the drive aisle enters just inside the property line. There are 3 bus bays facing Yonge Street. It goes around the corner. There are 3 bus bays facing Bernard. And that the building edge, the active edge of the building, where there is some commercial and there's also the waiting areas for the terminal, is separated from the street, from the sidewalk by the drive aisles for the bus themselves. And similarly, any passengers looking to get on these buses in the terminal have to cross the drive aisle. They don't go directly into the terminal.
And sir, I think you, if I could just interrupt you, sorry, I think you indicated that the rest of that building is not a bus terminal, but a commercial plaza. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And we can take a look. At some point, I believe I will be taking you to a plan that shows the ownership. That's coming.
Thank you. We'll get there.
We can see where that is. Now, if we go to the next page, we get the street view. So this is the street view from Yonge Street. Now, I'll admit it's got some construction things happening in the foreground, but again, to show you that the built edge is not sort of actively animating Yonge Street. And if we go to the next page, we will see the similar, and you can see some of the commercial signs and small doors. That's the commercial I was referring to. You can see a similar situation from Bernard. Now I'll take you to the policies that I feel the station in its current configuration is not conforming with. That is official plan policy. We go to tab 8 of Exhibit 1, the sections of the official plan, and I'll take you to page 641.
It's tab 1, Exhibit 1C, Volume 3.
Okay, so I'm referring to, we're in section 3.1, policy 4.1.4, 4.4.1 sub 5, development fronting on Yonge Street, 16th Avenue and Bernard Avenue shall be required to provide commercial, retail, community uses at grade in a mixed use building format. And then I'll take you to the secondary plan policies that deal with a similar issue. And that's tab 33. And if we go to page 2511, and deal with policy 12.1.3 sub 3B, and I'll encourage the establishment of vibrant, active, at-grade street frontages through the provision of commercial, retail, or community uses at grade in a mixed-use building format. And if we continue on to page 2513, policy 12.2.1 sub 3. Now we're getting into mixed-use policies. In addition to the requirements for non-residential uses of grade mixed-use building, I'll just skip down to development shall provide active at-grade street frontages through commercial, retail, or community uses at grade in the mixed-use building format along Yonge Street, Bernard, and along the planned local and collector streets as shown in Schedule 4. So this is referring specifically now to the Yonge and the Bernard frontages with that policy. And if we take a look at the picture that's on that page and policy 12.2.41 sub 2, sub 1 and sub 2, 12.2.41. So we have development shall generally orientate and place buildings at or near the street edge to animate and enhance the pedestrian realm. Where a continuous street wall exists within or nearby the Bernard KDA, such podiums shall generally be cited to maintain and enhance the street wall. And I think the picture beside that is also helpful to explain the kind of street environment they're hoping to achieve, which in my opinion, the current station does not. And finally, just to follow up on the reference to active uses, active at-grade frontages from the previous policy, if we go to Schedule 4, which is found on page 2535. And I would highlight if you look at the table of contents, zoom in a bit, please. You'll see at the right, active at-grade street frontages are a yellow band. And if we then scroll back to the map, you can see that yellow band is located along Bernard, along Yonge Street, and along the internal collector road shown. And I'm referring now to where it fronts Bernard and where it fronts onto Yonge Street. It's my opinion that a new terminal could also better implement these urban design policies, which is hindered by the current terminal design and land ownership configuration.
And sir, can I ask you whether, in your opinion, the proposed settlement in Exhibit 10 and 35 would assist or deter in implementing these urban design policies?
I think it would assist in implementing and giving greater flexibility to implement it on whatever lands become available and could potentially be coordinated with at the time the region is looking to expand the terminal.
Thank you. Thoughts with respect to the subdivision of land policy 12.5.5?
I've realized that I didn't show you the land ownership, and I think
Good point.
if it comes up to question, I don't want to waste the tribunal's time in searching it, but I can describe it briefly. The lands that the bus drive on itself, those lands are owned by the region. The sidewalk areas generally where people wait for the bus are an easement dedicated to the region. The balance of the building is owned by TSMJC. It's a commercial building, and there are some policies allowing use of some certain facilities in it, and I think there we go. It's good having two hands, having an assistant to carry this out. So if we look at Part 3 and Part 6, Part 6 you can see is pointing to that curved section. Part 3 and Part 6 are the lands owned by the region, And part 2 is the sidewalk area, which is an easement. Lands are owned by TSMJC. They're under the canopy of the building, and they're dedicated to, that easement is dedicated to the region for its use.
So just so we're clear, Mr. Swinton, because I think it's important, the bus terminal today, the existing bus terminal consists of an easement over part 3 ownership of part 3 by the region, and an easement over part 2, which is under the canopy, but outside of the existing plaza. Is that correct?
It's outside of the walls of the building itself, but it's under the canopy of the building. If we need to take a look at it, we can go back to the pictures, but
I think we've got it. That's fine.
And also part 6 is owned by the region.
Thank you. And none of the building, the retail building, is owned or subject to an easement in favor of the region.
Now, I believe there's a reference to use of washrooms or some other things like that and there's also a walkway that goes through that allows people to connect from the parking lot through. So, but that's in words in the agreement. And I just would note that this the survey document is from 1992. So that's when this was put in place.
But there's no seating area or kiosk within the building, is that correct?
I'm not aware of any, no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to move on to the section with regard to the policies related to subdivision of land. Policy 12.5.5. So if I take you first to the 2017, and I'll take you to the 2020 and note that if we look at 12.5.5 in Exhibit 1, tab 32, that's found on page 2503, you will note that policy 12.5.5 is highlighted all in red, which means that it was not in the 2017 approval by council. It was added in May 2020. And the policy requires at the city's discretion the submission of a plan of subdivision application in order to convey lands to the city and or the region for infrastructure, including bus terminal, through sections 5125 of the Planning Act. And now if I can take you to that section in the Planning Act that's found on tab Joint Book Exhibit 1, tab 1, and that's on page 57. And I'm looking at paragraphs the 25 and looking at paragraphs B and then B1. So the approval authority may impose such conditions to the approval of a plan of subdivision as in the opinion of the approval authority are reasonable, having regard to the nature of the development proposed for the subdivision, including a requirement that such highways, including pedestrian pathways, bicycle pathways, and public transit rights of way be dedicated as the approval authority considers necessary. And B1, that such lands be dedicated for commuter parking lots, transit stations, and related infrastructure for the use of general public use highways as the approval authority considers necessary. And in my opinion, the secondary plan policy introduced in May 2020 attempted to create a situation where dedications through this section of the Planning Act would not require compensation for the landowner providing the dedication. So if we then go to Exhibit 35, page 2, we can take a look at the settlement. And the language, the concern has been addressed through the addition of policies referencing fair market value, and you can see that in the third last line there. I'll read the addition. For the greater clarity, the owner providing the land to the region for the Bernard Bus Terminal shall be reasonably compensated for the fair market value of the land, providing provided using all funding mechanisms available, including but not limited to cost sharing agreements among all owners of lands within the KDA. And concerns been addressed through the fair market language in that policy and in referencing policy, and I think it's referenced further up, reference to policy 12.4.2. If we go to policy 12.5.5. So what's happened here, subject to policy 12.4.2 was added in. So it's referencing back to the policy we just discussed. What is also being done is the schedule. So we're clarifying that it's the schedule 3 and 4 show, I think schedules 1, 3, and 4 show the bus terminal, and they show it in its current location. And what they also show, and I think if we can go to tabs, Joint Book tab 33, so we can look at the schedules. You can see if we scroll down and look at the table of contents, you can see it says existing bus terminal. It says see policy 12.4.2.3, and that occurs on the 3 schedules. I don't think we need to look at all of them. And so the concern was the reference to that policy. So the settlement removes the reference to that policy. So we are acknowledging and understanding that the bus terminal is simply the existing terminal shown in its current location, and therefore not limiting the potential redevelopment of the terminal. And it's my understanding from the witness this morning, Mr. Cahoon, that it was his desire to ensure that a reference to the existing terminal remains. So that's the balance and compromise that was found to address the region's concerns as well as TSMJC's.
What's your opinion with respect to the settlement, Mr. Swinton?
I support the settlement and its revised wording for policies 12.4.23 and 12.5.5, which we've just looked at. I also support the agreement to remove the policy reference from the schedules and to label the location of the existing terminal only. And I recommend that the tribunal approve the settlement revised wording for policies 12.4.23 and 12.5.5, including the updated recommended modifications in Exhibit 10. And I recommend the tribunal support the removal of the policy reference in Schedules 1, 3, and 4.
All right. Anything else with respect to the bus terminal?
I believe that's it. I'd like to move on to the question of density.
Thank
And
you.
that's issues 29 through 37 in the TSMJC's issue list. And I think it also deals with YRA issues 1 to 4 and NEC's issue number 70. So first, I'd like to take you to the Part 1 official plan policy. Existing official plan Exhibit 1, tab 8, and go to page 572, paragraph 5. Okay, as you can see, just to reference on the right, it is highlighted. It is subject to appeal by TSMJC, appellant number 10, and it S, so it means it's applied, the appeal applies to the whole of the KDA. So the policy states developments in the centers and corridors shall accommodate the highest, not sure what that thing was, highest density and widest range of uses within the town, and shall be provided at an appropriate scale and density in accordance with policies of this plan. This includes a built form transitioning to the surrounding areas, ensuring the creation of high quality, human scale, pedestrian oriented public realm. This policy was subject to appeal and yet to be settled, and it's in my opinion that this policy is appropriate and forms the basis for the principles behind the secondary plan, and therefore needs to be in place in order for the tribunal to consider approval of the secondary plan and zoning, but that's a phase 2 issue. I'd then like to take you to Exhibit 1, tab 34. Tab 34 is dealing with zoning bylaw, and I want to draw your attention to 2 provisions in the zoning bylaw that I feel need to be reflected and dealt with properly in the Part 1 plan and the secondary plan. So that's why I'm taking you now to the zoning bylaw. Firstly, to provision 5.2.6, and that's found on page 2576. Now, these are dealing with existing situations and dealing with interim development in the existing situation prior to major redevelopment in keeping with the secondary plan. So 5.2.61 deals with enlargement, repair, and renovation. Non-compliant building or structure shall be deemed to comply with the development standards, the passage of this bylaw, and non-compliant building or structure may be enlarged, repaired, or renovated unless subject to 5.3.3. So if we now go to 5.3.3, which is found on page 572. Sorry. No. So I'm moving ahead of myself. If we can go to 5. There we go. Interim development. Notwithstanding any other provision of this bylaw, to the contrary, expansions of existing buildings or structures or new standalone buildings or structures shall be permitted provided the expansion of the new building or structure is for non-residential uses, and I don't need to get into the table there. The expansion or new building is no greater than 15% of the total gross floor area of the existing buildings or structures as of the date of the passage of this bylaw. And number C, have a minimum building height of 2 stories, not including below grade. So those are the points I wanted to okay, and then I guess the balance of that is saying what this doesn't comply to. So I want to take you back now to the Part 1 plan, tab 8 of Exhibit 1, policy 3.1.38. It's found on page 572. Again, an appealed policy. And the concern was development applications to amend the official plan that would have the effect of reducing the density of a site that has been designated for medium or high density residential development in the centers and the corridors shall only be considered through a municipal comprehensive review. So out of an abundance of caution, an application for a small piece of commercial addition or standalone, my concern was that could be deemed as not meeting the minimum density requirements of the secondary plan and therefore reducing the density as determined by this policy and would not be allowed unless it was considered through a municipal comprehensive review. So that was my concern with that.
And has your concern been addressed in the settlement with the city?
Yes, the settlement with the city amends the secondary plan policy 12.2.3 for the purposes of clarity to ensure that the applications which comply with zoning provisions 5.2.6 and or 5.3.3 are not deemed to contravene the secondary plan. And then as the secondary plan is more detailed. I've confirmed with the city that it takes precedent over Part 1, Policy 3.1.38, which we just looked at. So I'm comfortable to recommend the approval of 3.1.38 as it's worded. And I'll now take you to 12.2.35. And we can take a look at the additional wording added. This policy shall not preclude redevelopment and expansion of existing uses within the KDA as permitted through the implementing zoning bylaw. So these revisions give me the comfort that what was allowed in the zoning but not referred to in the secondary plan are now addressed in the secondary plan, and that takes precedent over the Part 1 plan. So I support both policy 12.2.35 as reworded. Again, I note the word new development. I missed that in my reading of it. And also the Part 1 policy 3.1.3 as currently worded.
Okay, any other policies related to the theme of density?
Okay, 3.1.43 of the official plan, Part 1, which is found again, Exhibit 1, Tab 8, page 574. Within the centers and corridors, the greatest mix and range of uses and the highest density shall be directed to the major public rapid transit terminals and stations. This policy was also subject to TSMJC's Part 1 appeal and is yet to be settled. And it's my opinion that the policy is appropriate and should be approved, especially in light of the minimum densities which York Region is now seeking at major transit station areas. And I'll take you to the, I don't know if I need to take you to it. I'll refer to the staff report from May 13th, 2020, simply to confirm that this is a major transit station area. So I'm not too sure if you want to see it, but I can confirm that and deal with it in questions if there is any question to it. So it's my opinion that a policy should be added to section 12.2.3, allowing implementation of increased density within the vicinity of transit terminal once its final location has been determined. And my understanding is that will be dealt with through the phase 2 hearing.
Okay, so we don't have to deal with that now.
No.
The next section.
Now, if I can go to Exhibit 34, the first page. We are now dealing with the amendments to the settlement amendments to the Part 1 plan. And if we can scroll down and take a look at policy 4.4.16. So originally there was just policy 6A, 6B was added. Could you just reduce that slightly? I'm having trouble reading the right portion of it with, thanks. So the proposed amendment to policy 4.4.16 of the Part 1 official plan maintains the minimum overall density of 2.5 FSI, but increases the maximum density for the overall KDA to 4 from the previous 3 approved in 2017, in keeping with increased growth expectations around major transit station areas anticipated by Bill 139 and York Region's associated minimum density targets. I'll get into that a little bit, but I don't want to deal with it too much because that was evidence covered by Ms. Anderson. I've reviewed the associated staff reports, background documentations, and applicable provincial policies. I've heard the evidence of Ms. Anderson, and I agree with the city's proposal to increase an overall density to a maximum of 4 FSI. The city's proposed amendment to policy 4.4.16 also introduces a provision that the allocation of density can be less than or greater than that is prescribed overall minimum and maximum on a parcel by parcel basis. So now we're looking at 4.4.16b, and it's referring specifically to the Bernard Yonge KDA. And I'm looking at the sentence, allocation of density within the KDA shall be specified in a schedule to the official plan and the implementing zoning bylaw. These allocations on a parcel by parcel basis can be less than and or greater than the prescribed overall density. The parcel by parcel density would then, I agree with this principle, the principle that density needs to be flexible. My concern is that the flexibility has not translated through to the secondary plan, and the schedules proposed for the secondary plan and zoning bylaw have not been developed with any consultation with TSMJC. And I'll refer to the staff report dated May 13th, 2020. That's tab 31 in Exhibit 1.
That's 1H, volume 8.
Page 2451. Paragraphs 1 and 2. A community design approach. I'm just having a little trouble reading. If you could reduce it slightly. The pictures of people are overlapping. So starting in the first sentence, from an urban design perspective, a community design approach exercise was undertaken in-house by city staff to model building massing, height, and density within the KDA secondary plan areas. Among other matters, an analysis was conducted to determine whether increasing site-specific densities and building heights greater than 3 FSI and 15 stories, as contemplated in 2017, could be accommodated within the KDA when applying the urban design principles, including the following: development block and density principles to ensure that development and the streetscape character contribute to an efficient and attractive pedestrian and vehicular connections. Staff analyzed the KDA area based on 16 manageable blocks that range in size from 0.9 hectares to 2.6 hectares. These blocks are located in 3 distinct character areas within the Bernard KDA, framed in part by the location of the new local road and the linear parks. These blocks have been assigned densities to ensure equitable distribution of the overall density and to provide effective built form transition from Yonge Street to the existing neighborhoods. The results of this in-house community design approach exercise were not made public until they appeared as tab 81 of the joint document book on June 30th, 2020. So if I can take you there now, and we can go to page 4927.
It's an Exhibit 1N, like Nancy.
There we go. So this is the design exercise as it relates to the southeast quadrant, including the TSMJC lands and the Leon's lands to the south. No consultation occurred with TSMJC to work out this plan and to work with TMJC's development application or concept plan for the whole of the lands. Now, one of the requirements of the application was to develop a concept plan for the area. And so I'll take you to that now. And that was submitted as part of the application in August 2016. So if we can go to Exhibit 53 and go to tab 9. And that's page 168. The other exhibit.
It's the Book of Documents exhibit
Yes.
51.
Okay, there we go. If we could zoom in on that. Just to show that this was the concept plan that was submitted at the time of the application. And again, at the time of the application, we were recognizing quite a different height regime. I think height regime looking at 15 stories. It was in consultation prior to the approval of the May or the 2017 approval. So that was the concept plan was submitted. So there's basically no coordination with the original concept plan submitted. And if we can go to page 173, that plan was divided into phasable development blocks. And this is
Mr. Chair. I'm sorry to interrupt the witness in the middle of his testimony. I do have a bit of a concern about the extent to which we're getting into this line of evidence, and I'll explain why. If you refer to the issues list, Exhibit 13, and you refer to the TSMJC issues list, the issues that they have raised with respect to density, a number of them have been resolved, issues 30 and 37. The remainder that have not been resolved, it has been agreed that all of them are to be deferred to phase 2. That was by agreement of the parties. I had no concern with the witness providing a bit of context for the concerns raised by TSMJC in relation to density. But when we start to veer into their specific concept plan, we've tried to hold the line very firmly when it comes to NEC. And I think for consistency, we should be taking the same approach when it comes to TSMJC, given their agreement that all those issues should be deferred to phase 2.
I think that's fair, Mr. Chair, and I take that comment in the spirit in which it was intended. So I'll ask Mr. Swinton, therefore, to confirm, well, just to summarize what, or perhaps conclude what his concern with the policy is, and then confirm that it's a policy that's been deferred to phase 2.
Okay. The concern was that the densities in the secondary plan and the zoning, the 5 times in the stretch along Yonge Street, 130 meter swath along Yonge Street, and the 3 times on the balance of the lands did not provide the flexibility necessary to properly to develop the site, in keeping with the flexibility provisions that are being added to the Part 1 policy. So I'm simply referring to that concern, supporting the Part 1 policy and the flexibility in it, and raising the concern as to why it is still an issue going on to phase 2, and that we're not here supporting the 5 and the 3 over the TSMJC lands in the secondary plan as it is before you today.
Thank you, Mr. Swinton.
I'd also point out one thing, that the design exercise that the city did not accommodate the transit station. There's no, it simply sets the building back on the TSMJC lands. There's no showing of driveways or any reconfiguration to accommodate the transit station if it was to be redeveloped on those lands. And it doesn't deal with issues related to like phasing or keeping key tenants and things like that. So these are my concerns with the design exercise that was referred to in the staff report. And also it requires coordination with adjacent landowners, because one of the parcels it's showing a building that is over 2 land ownerships, and the landowner to the south, Leon's, has had no active participation that I'm aware of in this entire secondary plan process. So
Okay.
I accept the city's proposal to create a new Part 1 policy, 4.4.16B, in part because it removes a reference also to development blocks. So if we go back and look, the boundaries of the, if you look at 4.4.16A, the black sentence at the end of that policy says the boundaries of development blocks shall be identified in a secondary plan. And then it refers to, in the first sentence, density of a development block shall be a minimum of 2.5 and a maximum of 3. And we were concerned that a development block was not sufficiently defined, was not defined in the secondary plan. And especially when you're dealing with the phased development, how can you deal with both the minimum and maximum, especially if you're dealing with the flexibility? So if a development block was, say, all of the TSMJC lands, developing a small portion of that would not meet the minimum. And if a development block was simply a site, then the flexibility would only be between, say, 2.5 and 3. And I'm now referring to the wording in the 2017 approval. So what has happened now, the policy 4.4.16B was added, increasing the range and giving further flexibility on a parcel by parcel basis. So we're not being restricted to an undefined term called a development block, which was my earlier concern. If we move on.
And sorry, Mr. Swinton, you may have said this, and if you did, I apologize, but what's your opinion with respect to the adequacy of the proposed amendment?
So 4.4.16B addresses that concern by referring to flexibility on a parcel by parcel basis and removing the relationship to development block for the Bernard Yonge KDA.
And your opinion is it is appropriate or not appropriate?
Yes, it's appropriate and should be approved.
Thank you.
Okay, if we move on to the next page, policy 4.4.17, it still contains a reference to development block. And for the purpose of clarity, it should be amended to be consistent with 4.4.16B and more precisely define the lands. So the sentence was added at the end of that. Now, it's my understanding that additional wording, or I don't think that's been brought before yet.
There's been no evidence of
Okay, so-
additional wording
So
presented to the tribunal.
I'll leave
So
that.
let's assume that none is coming, and
Okay.
if it is, we'll deal with it.
Okay, so I support the addition of the language, which then speaks to the concept plan in developing a concept plan for the quadrant which contains the development lands. So in the case of the TSMJC lands, that would be the concept plan would be required. Again, this is somewhat academic because this starts off with until such time as the council approves a secondary plan for the KDAs. So when we get through this process, we will have a secondary plan. But until then, I think for consistency, we deal with the quadrant instead of the development block.
And your opinion on this proposed mod, my apologies.
I support this proposed mod and I recommend its approval by the tribunal.
Thank you.
Okay, if we move down to policy 4.4.19, removes the height limit and relates height instead to density, angular plane, and the secondary plan policies. I agree with staff and Ms. Anderson's evidence that the 45-degree angular plane combined with a 10-meter wide neighborhood character area is an appropriate transition to the lands outside the KDA designated neighborhood. I agree that the tallest buildings within the KDA should be directed toward the intersection of Yonge and Bernard and along Yonge Street in general. And I support this proposed amendment that's on the screen before you.
Thank you. So in your view, what policies remain in the Part 1 plan to be determined in Phase 2 of the hearing?
Okay. So there are still nine policies unresolved. They were not included in TSMJC's additional Part 1 OP policies as they didn't fit the limited scope of the Phase 1 hearing. And I'll list them for you now. They are policies 3.2.1 sub 8, 3.2.1 sub 9, and they deal with the dedication of key hydrological features through an application process. Policy 3.2.1.2 deals with conservation plan areas. Policy 3.2.2.2 deals with sensitive groundwater features. Policy 3.3.3.2 sub 5 and sub 6 deals with new and major retail in an urban form within the KDA. 3.4.1 sub 39A deals with rhythm of facades and complementing adjacent buildings. 5.2.3 deals with tertiary or concept plans for the KDA. And 5.2.2 sub 3E deals with minimum densities at subway stations. So it's my recommendation that these remaining Part 1 policies be consolidated into the Phase 2 hearing. And at that time, the outstanding appeal of the Part 1 plan by TSMJCs can be fully resolved.
Okay, the next theme. Let you take a drink there.
Thank you. We're now getting into the transportation and road network questions, and it's my understanding that the extension of the public collector road going across Yonge Street, from Yonge Street to Yorkland at Justice, my understanding is that has now been moved to a Phase 2 issue. All I will simply say today is support the removal of that as a collector road with the recognition that there still should be some form of connection. And I think that's in keeping with the transportation reports that have been the latest transportation, the HDR report from the city. So I'd put it in the list because I recognized it was an issue from YRA, but it's my understanding that no evidence has been given on that. So I will skip to the next page. Which brings us to the holding bylaw. So if I take you to the Part 1 official plan, which is Exhibit 1, Tab 8, page 568.
So Mr. Swinton, can you just, before you go there, can you identify which issues we're talking about?
Okay, so it's TSMJC holding bylaw issues 42 to 44. That also addresses YRA issues 7 and 8 and NEC's issue number 88.
Thank you.
So if we go to the official plan policy 3.1.21, and if we go to table 1, I would just point that the table 1, it's the growth objectives, and at this time it was for 2031. The growth objectives identify a forecast of 242,000 people and 99,400 jobs for 2031. And if we continue down to policy 3.1.34 on page 572, speak to the hierarchy, identifies a hierarchy of intensity of growth areas within the city, with the KDA second only to the Richmond Hill Center. And Schedule A2, which is found on page 693. We don't need to go there, but simply to show that the Bernard Yonge area is identified as a KDA. I don't think we need to go to look at that. So I'd like to refer to now the staff report for May 13th, 2020, which is found in Exhibit 1, tab 31, and I'd like to take you to page 2437. So paragraph 4 identifies the center, the KDA as a center of a major transportation area identified by York Region's April 2019 Planning for Intensification Background Report, and that the MTSAs generally consist of a radius of 500 to 800 meters around the BRT station. So if we now scroll down to paragraph 5, in order to meet the minimum target densities of 200 residents and jobs per hectare for the entire MTSA, the staff report recognizes that if the KDA achieves a density of 3.84, 510 residents and jobs per hectare within the KDA, it would achieve an MTSA density of 140 residents and jobs per hectare for the 800 meter radius, or 220 residents and jobs per hectare for the 500 meter radius. And if we go to page 2438, scroll down a little bit, just to state a minimum density target of 200 residents and jobs per hectare was established by the region as the minimum target density for this MTSA, along with a targeted mix of 80% residential and 20% jobs, found in the middle of that paragraph. And as per the witness of statement of Mr. Carr, if we can go to Exhibit 52, tab 5, page 99. And if we look at paragraph 4.5.5, and zoom in one more time, please. Note that as illustrated in the figure below, falls at the low end of this target. So if the goal is to be reach the desired modal splits for the table in the secondary plan. So this is all about getting at the modal splits question within the holding provisions. So the concern is that even at the densities that we're looking at, we're still at the low end. I agree with Mr. Carr. I support his position on this for the secondary plan holding provisions in 12.5.4.2 sub 1. I'd now like to take you to the witness statement of Ms. Sterling, which is found at tab 3 of Exhibit 52. And if I go to page 51, and just scroll down a little bit, summary paragraph 6, Roman numeral 6, the modal split criteria included in the holding provision policy is not a practically measurable. Therefore, the lifting of the holding provision is not practical and in some cases not feasible. So I accept Ms. Sterling's conclusion there. And if we can then pop back to Mr. Carr's evidence with his witness statement and go to page 100. Sorry, that's tab 3. And paragraph 4.6.2, it is my opinion that density is required to achieve the transit modal share targets noted in each development scenario noted in the holding bylaw, and it would be difficult to achieve the modal share target without allowing the density to be developed first. And I think if we want to talk about a math exercise, if you have 200 residents and you have a 20% modal share, and you then go up to 400 residents and say with a 20% modal share, you then have double the number of bus patrons. And hopefully with double the number of bus patrons, York Region would increase the transit service. And with more transit service, say you're running 3 buses an hour as opposed to 2 buses an hour, the potential is there for more improved modal split. So I'm just trying to put what I read in Mr. Carr's into my own understanding in layman's terms, why the density is necessary to increase the modal split.
So what's your opinion with respect to the modal split requirement in the secondary plan holding policy?
I support the revisions to the modal split requirements in the secondary plan holding policy 12.5.4.2, and that's found in Exhibit 35 on page 7. And I'm not going to go into any detail on that because Ms. Sterling is up next in evidence. I just here to say that I support her position and I support the amendments to the policy. And if we can, while we're there, if we can go to actually, before we go to the now looking at the physical improvements, I think I'd like to go first to Ms. Sterling's witness statement again on tab 3 in Exhibit 52. Page 54. I'm looking for Ms. Sterling's witness statement. So it's Exhibit 52, tab 3. We'll come to this shortly. Okay, so I agree with the evidence of Ms. Sterling that the improvements A to G in the secondary plan policies 12.5.4.2 are intended to serve the broader community, including the Bernard KDA, and that's in her paragraph 14. Now, if we go to Exhibit 1, tab 84, and take a look at the HDR report. Page 5047 and 5048. And I would simply note that items A, B, C, and F are currently under construction. And items D and E that were in that list of improvements for the secondary plan are expected to be completed by 2026. I would note that I did the calculation of the current density on the TSMJC lands, and that density is 0.24 FSI. So if we go to Exhibit 52, tab 7, page 131, we get the aerial view of the KDA. So if we can zoom out a bit to get a good, so you can see the TSMJC lands labeled there. So is my expectation that the density of the whole of the KDA is fairly close to the order of magnitude of the TSMJC lands. I don't have the stats on a site-by-site basis, but I expect it's in a relatively similar order of magnitude. So it's my expectation that the trigger density of 3.0 FSI, which was referenced in the February 2020 version of the secondary plan, and which is now in the May version is 10,400 residents and jobs, is far enough away that these holding requirements will most likely be constructed by the time that the holding provisions would come into consideration. I therefore support the revisions to the holding policies to reduce the process necessary for removing the H prior to the KDA reaching the trigger density of effectively 3.0, but as stated in the secondary plan, 10,400 residents and jobs. Ms. Sterling in her evidence stated the improvements identified in 12.5.4.2G have been removed from York Region's 10-year capital budget. If we want, we can go to Ms. Sterling's witness statement, but I think that's been the evidence.
I think that's an evidence
already. And it's my understanding that would likely require an environmental assessment when being reintroduced, and therefore would be a significant amount of time away before it would be under construction as required by the holding provisions. It's my opinion that it's inappropriate for the city to put an H provision on a project that is not planned to be implemented in the foreseeable future, and the implementation is not subject to the city's control. So I therefore support the removal of this as a holding provision if it's not within the York Region's 10-year capital plan. And again, that's a change to the holding provision. So if we go to Exhibit 35, we can see the changes that I've been referring to. And I think also so I think we can, I don't want to get into them in detail. I think they've been seen before. I support those. And I would also note that in okay, now I'd like to get into the non-residential component. So if we can take a look at the schedule, just scroll it up to, oh, I think we're going by the table. From a mixed-use perspective, the analysis assumes that there is an increase in non-residential GFA to support achieved transit modal splits in the minimum. There is no net loss of residential GFA. So I would take you to the policies that relate to the non-residential in the secondary plan, and those are found in tab 32, page 2482, and that's sections 12.2.1, Okay, 12.1, 12.2.12, if we can just scroll down a little bit, is a new policy that was added. It was not a policy in the 2017 council approval. And I would note that the new policy in the third sentence, new development, starting in the second line, the new development which includes one or more active at-grade frontages as shown on Schedule 4 is encouraged to allocate a minimum of 15% of its total gross floor area to non-residential uses. And so if we now scroll down to policy sub 4, development on lands with existing non-residential uses such as retail, office, community, or commercial uses shall, previously it said generally maintain the amount of gross leasable floor area. It now, that was 2017, it now says shall increase or maintain the amount of gross leasable floor area that has been devoted to those uses. Essentially those commercial uses as of the November 2017 order. So what was previously a general comment is now a required minimum. So if we go now and take a look at the Schedule 4, the active uses of grade. And I think the reason I'm getting into this is because the question has come out about deferring a portion of the holding provisions. The portion that relates to tying it to the commercial amount of commercial uses. And the position before the board is that that gets deferred to phase 2 hearing. So I'm putting forward my evidence in support of deferring it to the phase 2 hearing, raising the issues with these commercial policies so that the holding policies related to that get addressed at the same time as these policies themselves are heard. So I'm going into a little bit of phase 2 issues, but it's really basically to justify why these policies are at issue for TSMJC and why it is therefore appropriate that the holding provisions that relate to these policies also be deferred to the phase 2 hearing. So that's why I'm giving evidence on something that is essentially a phase 2 matter.
So given that it is a phase 2 matter, sir, perhaps you could do that quickly.
Okay, so basically I just want to point out that the areas that require average or active frontages of grade significantly apply to the TSMJC lands over the other lands. You'll note that none of the Canyon Hill frontages have that requirement. And even on the east side, TSMJC is the only lands that have that requirement internal to their site. So it's my opinion that TSMJC, it's putting a significant burden on TSMJC. Also, if you go to, and I'll just summarize fairly quickly, the zoning schedule identifies the amount of lands that are existing commercial, and the secondary plan policies seek to maintain those amounts of commercial. So TSMJC has slightly over 50% of all of the commercial within the KDA. So again, that policy, and I believe the holding provision that we're discussing can be interpreted both to deal with the retention of existing commercial as well as the 15% requirement associated with the average or active uses of grade, puts a fairly unfair burden on TSMJC, which is an issue that they intend to address in the phase 2 hearing. So it's my opinion that the holding provisions that relate to that should also be adjourned to the phase 2 hearing. And if the tribunal were to approve or choose to hear those at this phase 1 hearing, it would be my recommendation, it's my opinion, that those should not be approved, the policies related to the holding provisions. And I'm going through fairly quickly as opposed to taking you to the detailed things. And I think if we can go and look at the recommendations now, I believe they're found on in Exhibit 35. And if we can take a look at the, I guess that and further down, yeah, so if we're looking at policy 2 here, the highlighted ones in yellow, it's the recommendation, and it says beside note, defer to phase 2 for all of the KDA. Lifting of the H shall be subject to requirement that prior to approval of any proposed new development, the proponent demonstrates to the satisfaction of council that the mix of land uses is provided on the site, including plans that ensure the replacement of any existing non-residential gross floor area, which would be displaced as part of the provision in accordance with policy provided in section 12.2.1. So I support that, and if the tribunal should choose to hear it, I would recommend that that be then removed from the holding provisions. I was going to get into, I guess, the HDR report in relationship to the amount of density considered, but I think I will not worry about that because that's getting into a level of detail that again should be put off to the phase 2 hearing.
Thank you for that. Are there any other issues that you wish to address?
Okay. So I now want to take you to the part 1 policy that deals with the H, and that is found on, and I didn't put in the reference, it's back in tab 8, and it's part 1 official policy 5.7 sub 2. So if we go, it's exhibit 1, tab 8, the parent plan, the part 1 plan. And if we go down to, and I'm sorry, I don't have the page reference in front of me, policy 5.7.2. Actually, I think it can be found in Exhibit 4 as well, if that's easier. Or you're there now. You're there now. That's fine. Okay, so that's the whole of the. Sorry, I've been bouncing around a little bit trying to move forward, and I've lost my place. If you can give me 1 second. So 5.7.2 is the appeal. So if we look at exhibit so 34, can you just zoom out so I can see the whole of that for a second? Okay. Okay, so I also support the approval of the part 1 holding policy 5.7 sub 2, subject to the amendments to the secondary plan policy. And if the tribunal should choose to not defer the secondary plan policies related to the commercial, the mix of uses provisions, I would request also that this holding policy also be adjourned so that it be dealt with in its entirety. So that the holding provisions in the Part 1 plan don't kick into place until the holding provisions are fully adjudicated.
But I think you previously told us that you support the proposed mods in
Yes.
Exhibit 35 to Section 12.5.4.2. Is that correct?
Yes, with the exclusions of those highlighted in
Yes,
yellow.
which are deferred to phase 2.
Yeah, so I would recommend that those be approved in the secondary plan. And then I'm just reading my notes again. So I think I need to say that we should support the official plan Part 1. I correct myself, in order for the Part 2 holding provisions to be approved. So I'm getting twisted around because I'm moving on my my evidence outline. So I support the revisions to the holding policies in Exhibit 35 with the exclusions of the highlighted yellow areas. And therefore, with that approved and with the areas excluded, I would support the holding provisions in the Part 1 plan and policies 5.7.2. I simply just like to acknowledge the procedural agreement which adjourns the balance of the secondary plan schedules and the zoning bylaw as they apply to the Southeast Quadrant to Phase 2.
Right. And if you could conclude then and give the tribunal a summary of your professional opinion, that would be appreciated, sir.
So if we can have Exhibit 34 handy first and then Exhibit 35. It's my opinion that the Part 1 policies 3.1.35 and 3.1.43 support the Bernard KDA secondary plan and zoning bylaw and should be approved without amendment. I agree with the city's proposed amendments to Part 1 official plan policy 4.4.16 and 4.4.19 and recommend they also be approved. And it's my opinion that the minor modifications for consistency for consistency with the Part 1 official plan policies 3.1.38 and 4.4.1 sub 7. And I recommend that those minor modifications as shown in Exhibit 34 also be approved. Now turning to the secondary plan and Exhibit 35. It's my opinion that the settlement amendments to the secondary plan holding provisions in 12.5.42 better address the broader growth goals and should be approved. And as such, I can now recommend approval of the Part 1 policy 5.72. It's my opinion that the settlement amendments to policy 12.4.23 address my previous concerns that the policy was too restrictive to allow for the appropriate range of options for the redevelopment of the Bernard bus terminal, especially given the early stages of planning for the station at York Region, and I recommend that this amendment be approved. This policy as amended. And I believe the newly proposed policy 12.5.1 better clarify the process by which land can be taken and the obligations of the municipality when taking lands. With the addition of the cost sharing and compensation provisions added to policies 12.4.23, I'm comfortable that both policies better protect the landowner on which lands accommodate the future bus terminal from, let's call it loosely, an abuse of the process of Section 51.25. of the Planning Act. And those are my conclusions.
And sir, I didn't take you to the provincial, regional, or local planning documents because several witnesses have given evidence on that. But let me just ask you globally whether with these recommended or proposed modifications, do you share the view of the other planning witnesses that with those proposed mods there is consistency and conformity with provincial, regional, and local plans and policy statements?
Yes, I do, especially in dealing with minimum target densities associated with MTSAs. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay, 12:51, we'll have lunch for 3/4 of an hour.